Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. So while you finally start to be less physically distant and you wind up running into somebody with some just misguided idea of how life is supposed to be, you have some answers. Joining us now from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and you'll sense a theme pretty quickly on today's program, is John Berlau. John, welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing well, Joe. How are you doing?
Well, you know what? We're figuring new things out. I just worry about a world where we're told that we're not supposed to interact with each other, because I think the human condition is really best suited by being in the room together with each other, don't you?
Yes, but I mean, we're lucky that technology can bring the room together, in situations where you can't, or it's inadvisable. And actually, I write in my book, George Washington Entrepreneur, that he's actually, in some ways, a father of American technology and invention.
Yeah, well,
because of the way he encouraged inventors.
You jumped ahead, and that's why we have him. He's got a brand new book. It's called George Washington Entrepreneur, and so much, is given to the import of this one man, and unfortunately right now vilified by so many people for some reason that only can be fitted into the explanation that they want to destroy everything conceptually that America has become since the founding of the nation. But you talk about the technological advances. Washington was, and maybe it was his military experience, somebody that was always open-minded to new technologies, even in the 18th century.
Yes, well, really, it's his experience. The book is called George Washington Entrepreneur, and it is his background as being someone who is largely self-taught, because his parents, his father died when he was 11, and the family couldn't afford to finish his education, so he basically quit formal schooling at 14 and never went to college like Jefferson and others did. But he constantly read and was constantly experimenting with new ideas. He started out as a surveyor. Then, when he acquired title to Mount Vernon through a variety of circumstances. He saw that tobacco was hurting the soil, and that he couldn't really brand tobacco, so he switched to wheat and hemp and other crops that he was reading from the British agriculturalists. Then he made a flour mill to process the wheat and then trademark the flour. And then finally, after he was president, and Mount Vernon recently rebuilt that, a whiskey distillery. Yep. But he was always interested, and always, even as a private citizen, helping out early American inventors.
Well, and he really grasped the idea of entrepreneurship. We talk a lot about the founding fathers. This one was a lawyer. This one, had a farm. Washington was just, it seemed like he was always tinkering with something new. The distillery is just astounding to, and that they found recipes and were able to go back and recreate a lot of the things he was doing then, which are still in many cases industry standard.
Yes. I think trademarking might be the best example. That wouldn't be until the late 19th century before the U.S. got some kind of trademarking law, like around the late 1890s or that era. But Washington, first he was in the House of Burgesses, which was like the colonial legislature. He created a system for people to register their flour that was open to anyone. Then he did at the Fairfax County Court, put in his signature, G. Washington, and it became known for quality throughout the colonies in the British West Indies and in Great Britain itself. And in fact, that might have been why he was so well known. One of the reasons he was so well known to members of the Continental Congress. Adams specifically mentioned Washington's independent fortune in nominating him to be general for the Continental Army.
When you look at that one thought of being able to register the things you invent, that was, and you mentioned that, I mean, even the U.S. government didn't really come up with a good way of codifying it until much later, but the idea that the things you invent, the things you create are yours even beyond just the ownership of property or land or a house or a horse or a wagon, the idea that your ideas are something you could own seems unique to him as well. Why do you think that is?
Well, there were patents in Britain, but he and other places, but he very much. I mean, he tinkered with new plows and things like that at Mount Vernon, and new ways to store manure, what he called the dung repository. Mm-hmm. But he really saw early on that inventions were going to be key to progress in things like navigating the river. So when he was president, before he was president, after he was general, he befriended this tinkerer in Bath, Virginia, which is now Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, James Rumsey, who everyone had dismissed as a crackpot, and wrote a letter of endorsement for Rumsey's mechanical boat, and got state patents in Virginia and Maryland before there was a federal patent. And then Rumsey sailed a steamboat in 1787, 20 years before Robert Fulton commercialized it, and then as president, Washington gave Rumsey and also an inventor named Robert Fitch the patent of the steamboat. Washington actually, after the Patent Act passed, the president reviewed patents and signed them.
Wow. You want to talk about a much different time. Can you imagine if the president had to do that today?
Yes, it's a much different time. At the same time, we worry about things, and Washington did too, about the administrative state when you have unelected officials making decisions, mm-hmm. and so it really was a time of representative government. In fact, Washington even warned some things about the administrative state and the mm-hmm. executive usurping power from the legislative in his farewell address. So that was all part of his vision as far as the separation of powers and also having electoral accountability.
John Berlau is on with us from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, but more importantly, the author of a book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. John, one of the things that Washington is credited for in sort of inventing the role of U.S. president by being called into the convention where it had been called under the pretense of fixing the Articles of Confederation, trying to figure out a way that it was going to work better. And this is where Madison brings up the Constitution, becomes known as the Constitutional Convention. But it was not going anywhere until Washington gets called in and sort of uses his command ability to bring coalition together, to get everyone sort of rowing in the same direction. Is that come from, or is that part of why he was such a good entrepreneur as well, because he was able to bring people in and get them working together and also seem to be honestly curious and hearing everyone before a decision is made?
Definitely. One of the books Washington read was The Rules of Civility, and it talks about, how listening is more important than talking, and Washington at the Constitutional Convention was there, and his presence there brought people there, but he famously didn't say much publicly. And then as president, he created what is essentially the cabinet, of where you have meetings and, among the department heads and discussions. There were certain departments established in the Constitution, but nothing like a cabinet, and that's a tradition that's talking about his inventions that he invented, and that is has continued throughout the presidency all the way to the current one.
With all the controversy that swirls around the Founding Fathers right now, and certainly they were creatures of their time, seems to be too easy of an excuse, but they were men who grew up in a post-European world where certain beliefs about the way people lived and acted determined their what you call it, their civil state. But that being said, what kind of peril do we face if we start taking people like George Washington out of history books and erasing them from history?
We face the peril that we don't learn from our history. We don't learn from, how these, in part, not all, rose above their times. How Washington, helped how Washington, rose, bootstrapped himself, wasn't from really the top family, wasn't at the bottom, the top family, but rose to become, a great entrepreneur and then president, and also championed who were the persecuted at the time, and gave them more rights. He spoke at one of my scenes in the book is when he spoke at the Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island in 1790, and said to bigotry, we give in his his first year as president, said we give to bigotry no sanction in the United States, and also he championed Irish Catholics like his general and who served under him, and frequently business partner John Fitzgerald, who was an Irish Catholic immigrant. And Catholics had been heavily persecuted, especially in Virginia, where they couldn't serve in juries and pray in public. So, and on slavery, I mean, he can be faulted as the others can, but it was a system he grew up in as a natural order, and of course existed in many places of the world beyond America. But he was the only founding father who had slaves to have freed all of his slaves, and also provided provided for them in their old age once they were free. So he went further, and he had expressed his opposition to slavery in letters. So there were nobody was the perfect man, but there are things we can learn from him. I mean, most important of all is being the first leader of a major nation to voluntarily give up power.
Yeah, well, that's to me my favorite. My favorite portrait in the Capitol building is the portrait of Washington turning in his command, because to me that was the moment where he's in a room full of people who are ready to say, "Hey, you're the general, you won the war, you're in charge, and you have unlimited executive power." And he comes in and says, "That's it, fight's over, I'm retiring," and really sort of set the United States in a different path than he could have.
Yes.
So, what are the things that people don't, and the whiskey distillery, the flour? A lot of folks didn't know that, and certainly the steamboat and the role Washington played in that. What are some of the more surprising things? Are those the ones I just listed from the book, John?
Well, a couple other surprises. One is that he had a lifelong love of pineapples and citrus fruits that he tasted, and I'm like, where would he get a pineapple? But he had been to the Barbados. It was his only overseas trip. He never went to Europe, and he went to Barbados with his brother with the hopes of, getting his brother well when he was sick. It didn't work, but Washington also saw some of the other things like the citrus fruit and pineapples, and would order them and have them shipped, and then later would build, and Mount Vernon has rebuilt, a greenhouse to grow citrus fruits in these that wouldn't otherwise survive these Northern Virginia winters. I mean, a greenhouse back then, and
Wow.
would corresponded with a widow who had married into a Catholic family in Maryland about that, and would just diligently ask her advice and be the eager student. It was I quoted those letters at the beginning, and also there was an experiment he did with Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, when Thomas Paine was a house guest, where they lit fires on a river in New Jersey. And proved that there was natural gas there in about 1783. And some scientists today say that experiment is as important, if not more important, than Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment with the lightning. So that he would experiment, that his mind was in its own way as creative as that as Jefferson and Franklin. So many little incidents like that, and just the way he managed things, like when people were coming to visit Mount Vernon after he was general, and almost even then was becoming a shrine. And he said, give everyone who is non-drunk, something to eat and drink. But then he said, don't give them the good wine. Don't give them the good Madeira. Give them the claret. Only serve the Madeira for dignitaries. But he wrote this to like his sort of household manager. So I would put something. I think you would love things like cheaper wine, like $2 Chuck.
Oh, hold it. I love $2 Chuck. As a matter of fact, I'm sitting not 3 feet from a case of it. So.
Okay, but just in general, just that there was so much to him, beyond a personality, beyond the face of the dollar. He could be a funny guy as well. So it was, and just also his partnership, and that Martha was a savvy businesswoman, pretty much herself.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the partnership they had, I think, is important as well, because he was able to put so much of himself into what he was doing, and missing Martha, but able to come back as well. One last one for you, John. So much is just words on paper. Give us a feel. Does your book kind of get into the personality of Washington? Because I feel like as you talk, I'm getting more sense of the kind of person he was to meet and talk to than you get from a lot of history books. Does that come through in your book?
I try very hard to make it make it sort of beyond the face of the dollar. So many people respect Washington, at least most Americans do, but they don't, they can't relate to him. It seems like it's Hamilton or Jefferson or Franklin. I try to get that, and I quote at length his letters, like where he's negotiating for the price of tobacco, and going about his business pursuits. And I think particularly entrepreneurs today can relate to that, of his struggles with entrepreneurs. So it's another dimension of how great he is, but also how in some ways relatable he is.
Well, what we have to do is get a copy of your book to Lin-Manuel and see if he can turn your book into a Broadway play, and then Washington will get the run he deserves. John, thank you. So thank you so much for it again. It is George Washington, Entrepreneur. Best place to get it, Amazon, or should we go to Competitive Enterprise?
Everywhere where books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you shop for books. If it's not there, ask for it. It's been going up the Amazon charts, but it's been selling in a lot of other places. We had a nice review in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago.
Oh, very good. Excellent, John. Thank you so much, sir, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks so much. I appreciate this.
Up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, we turn to another the institute that bears this founding father's name, the Thomas Jefferson Institute. Chris Brownlick, and an article he just wrote about collective bargaining agreements and law enforcement. Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.